What I think is we're actually dealing with is as I say, some kind of operating system that can be hacked using words. And words seem to be the binding agent for this thing, whatever it is. So I wrote this comic book, and as I wrote it, it became true. If I put the character through a situation where he was being tortured, where his lungs had burst and he was being held in captivity and subjected to all these awful things, 3 months later I'm in hospital, 2 burst lungs, dying of blood poisoning and facing exactly the same shamanic trial that I put my character through.
Our minds are excellent storytellers. It's how we make sense of the world. Every experience that we have is categorized and placed into a chronology of cause and effect, which informs our understanding of the world around us. What stories do you tell yourself? What stories have you told yourself today about who you are, about how the world works, and what's your place in it? What if we could rewrite this narrative, take these experiences and reorganize them into a story of our design? I'm Finch, and today I'm going to be talking about hypersigils, the magic of storytelling. I'm going to dive into a bit about what hypersigils are. I'm going to get a little bit into the concepts about why they work and why they're so powerful. And then I'm going to give a couple examples of how you can use these techniques to start living out the stories that you want to be living out. With that, let's get into hypersigils. Hey, it's me, Finch from the editing bay. I'm having some trouble editing this video, and I've been working on it for a long time. So let me catch you up to speed with what's been happening. I started this video the same way I start all of my videos, which is with a lot of research and then doing some of the technique myself. So in this case, hypersigils. I started making a hypersigil as a blog online while also doing research into hypersigils, Grant Morrison and Aidan Wachner. I then wrote my script, I shot my monologue, and started to get into editing it, which is how I do pretty much all of my videos up to this point. But as I started editing it, I realized that none of my thoughts were really well put together. I was thinking about hypersigils, which as a concept is basically a narrative that influences life. And this concept actually is an older concept than hypersigils, as Grant Morrison coined them. This concept, as far as my research points out, it was first really advocated for by Oscar Wilde. He has an essay called The Decay of Lying, which is really this kind of pushback against this sort of naturalist, like Aristotelian idea of art, that art is trying to capture something perfect, right? That art is an imperfect representation of the perfection that's reality. In The Decay of Lying, Oscar Wilde kind of goes the other way. He says, no, reality is trying to capture the perfection of art, right? That art is perfect and reality is imperfect. Reality is like this mimicry of art. So this concept, by the way, is called anti-mimesis. So I started kind of basing my theory around anti-mimesis, right? Or this kind of idea that art is perfect, creativity is perfect, and life follows. And then that started uncovering a lot more concepts about what is a magician? What is an artist? What are we doing when we're making magic, right? What are we doing when we're making art? And at a certain point, I got really lost in the weeds. I think I kind of lost the thread on what I was doing. So I started getting into some more research, and I came across Arden Leigh's videos. And Arden is a musician and actually a student of Grant. So I thought they would be a perfect person to reach out to. I sent them an email, and they very graciously decided to meet with me. And we talked about hypersigils, we talked about art and music and Grant Morrison. And unfortunately, it kind of sent me spinning off even further into kind of questioning all of the work that I've been doing. And since a hypersigil requires narrative, I want to bring you into the experience of me making this video. So this video may be a bit different than my other ones, and I appreciate you bearing with me. With that, let's cut to whatever I'm going to cut to.
What I noticed was that the things that I was writing into my songs ended up becoming sort of self-perpetuating truths. So I would say a hypersigil is a work of narrative magic that uses plot and character and storytelling in order to alter reality in accordance with will and intent. My name is Arden Leigh, and I have been a practicing magician for I'm gonna say probably about 7 or 8 years with any degree of seriousness anyway. And I'm the creator of the Repatterning Project, which is an 8-week course in understanding the human operating system and undoing trauma imprints and social conditioning in order to repattern towards creative freedom. And I'm also the front woman and sole proprietor of my solo project, Arden and the Wolves. Starting, about this time last year, I started having more opportunities to do collaborations and tracks that weren't costing me as much, if any, budget up front. And now all of a sudden I'm writing more songs than I have intent for, right? Yeah, it was rather shocking to see elements from those songs that I had not specifically intended as magic show up in my reality, and where it was like, oh man, I have become more powerful than I anticipated, and I have to be more responsible with the things that I'm writing. There are people who argue that your social media is a hypersigil because you are deliberately selecting the parts of your reality that you want to highlight, and that becomes the story of your life. Honestly, I think it's, in terms of magical terminology, it's one of the things that I think is actually like one of the most overused terms. There's people who are like, oh, your closet is a hypersigil because, how you choose to dress affects how people perceive you. And I'm like, there's truth in that, but it's at the end of the day, then it's like your whole life is an act of magic. But then when you do get to that point, I think that's when you're really in true magicianship, when your life is an act of magic.
Hypersigil as a term, as far as I can tell, was coined by Grant Morrison, referring to his comic book, The Invisibles. He claims that the main character in the comic book, The Invisibles, represented him. It was a retelling and a reimagining of his life. And he says that at a certain point, whatever happened to the character in the comic book began to happen to him in real life, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. Grant Morrison used the term hypersigil as an extension of the concept of sigils, which I've done a video about if you're not aware, so go check it out if you haven't seen that one yet. But to summarize, sigils are encoded desires that the operator or the magician would use to sync these desires into our subconscious so that they'll manifest later in real life. Grant Morrison takes this concept of sigilization of desires and adds a fourth dimension to it. He extends the sigil through time so that it changes and is mutated by dramatic factors like characterization, plot, and drama. And so using all these things, Morrison claims to be able to author his life. In his book, Weaving Fate, Aidan Wachter gives an example of a hypersigil that we can create for ourselves. He calls it the Black Book, and it is a journal that we write from the perspective of the future. So if there is an event that we want to transpire, we write a journal entry in the Black Book as if it has already happened, describing what it was like when it did happen. I've used this technique for a while, and I found it to be particularly effective. The steps that he gives for creating the Black Book are pretty straightforward. I'm going to summarize them here, but if you're interested in trying this method, I recommend that you check out his book, Weaving Fate. I'll leave a link below in the description. But Wachter is a talented magician, a great writer, and I find all of his work very accessible. The steps that he gives are to first prepare your tools. The tools that he recommends are a pen and a notebook, and that these tools need to be consecrated. So I've talked about consecration before, but for our purposes, consecration is simply deciding that a tool has a purpose and only using that tool for that purpose. Now you can do a small ritual if you're more comfortable with this. It can be simply a saying of a brief oath that you'll only use the pen. It can even be more of a ceremonial magic ritual if you want to summon spirits in to help with the consecration. These details are really what's most comfortable with you and how you prefer to work. Wachter also suggests that you create a charm of road opening. I'm going to leave this recipe out for this video, but if you're interested in learning how to make one of these charms, check out the book. I think it's an important part of the spell under Wachter's magical modality because the actions of going about and gathering these ingredients are putting forth effort into sealing the act of the book. But for our purposes, I think any sort of magical preparation that you're most comfortable with will increase the efficacy of this book. I want to keep this video focused on the hypersigil aspect, but do know that this creating of the charm of road opening is an important part of building the book in Weaving Fate. The next step that he gives are simply to begin writing in the book. And he makes some really good suggestions as far as not worrying so much about writing the wrong thing. It's more important to write and to get into the flow of writing. He suggests being very descriptive, which should allow you to more fully inhabit the scene that you're writing. And he also says to explore and experiment. He talks about a lot about the feedback loop and some other stuff which we'll get into later. But fundamentally, that is the creation of the hypersigil. You get a book, you get a pen, you decide that the book is your hypersigil, and you begin writing journal entries of stuff that you want to have happen. So what are we actually doing when we're making this hypersigil? To understand that, we need to take a look in how the brain works and processes memory. What happens when we remember an event is we first see some activity in the hippocampus, which is the recall of the event, which then gets moderated by the thalamus, which moderates that event and these other very complicated systems of the brain. So we see activity in the neocortex, which processes spatial reasoning and higher reasoning. We see activity in the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain. And all of this kind of fires off through the thalamus, which is like a circuit board for all of these systems. What's really interesting is that when we imagine an event, when we imagine something that hasn't happened, we see a really similar type of activity in the brain. In fact, it's very subtle differences, and the only difference really is what happens in the hippocampus. Right? So we're still seeing this activity from the place where our memories are coming from, but they're almost being remixed and rephrased to us in a different way. And then we see all the same kind of responses of emotional, of spatial reasoning, of a lot of these different systems being fired off in the brain. So what I believe is happening when we're making a hypersigil is we're blurring the lines between memory and imagining. So ways that we can increase the effectiveness of this hypersigil are by creating what I like to call a feedback loop. Aidan Wachner talks about the feedback loop quite a bit, and although he doesn't go into too much detail about it, he seems to also believe it's really important. I've found this as well in my own work. Now, the feedback loop is where we begin to see this really intense blurring of memory and imagining. And so there's two things that we can do to really increase the potency of this feedback loop. And the first one is to involve actual events, right? Involve actual memories and intermingle them with the fantasy. So if my Black Book goal is to travel to Europe, then before I make that entry, or in that entry itself, I want to include some actual memories that I have had. So if, for example, before I sit down to write in my Black Book, I just got off the phone with a friend and we talked about a movie, I would involve that in the writing of the Black Book. So I would say, oh, I just got off the phone with so-and-so. We talked about this movie. We laughed a lot. And as we were talking, I looked out the window of the train and saw the rolling Scottish countryside, right? So I'm starting to make this connection where the actual memory blurs into the desired memory. The second thing we can do to increase this feedback loop is to write about things that are about to happen so that we get that immediate response of having wrote it in the Black Book and then experiencing it. If I'm about to go to a party, then I'd write an entry in the Black Book about being at that party. This gives us this kind of immediacy of response. This is really similar, if you're familiar with more advanced sigil magic, to robo-fishing, or the idea of making a magical intention on something that you know will come true in order to sort of prime the pump. So we begin to both imagine events that will happen and remember events that haven't happened, and the brain starts to blur the lines between these two things. So we may find ourselves at a certain point writing in the hypersigil. And this is really powerful too. We begin deepening that feedback loop, and the lines between me as the character and me in my real life become more and more blurred, which is exactly what we want. We want this sort of breaking down, this collapsing of our actual experienced life and our memories in the fictionalized life. I have found over the past few months that I've been doing this process of hypersigiling that it really is it can be incredibly shocking at times, where I'll write something in the book and almost immediately there's the person that I wrote about appears in my life. But it's also very subtle in a lot of ways too, where the lines between me and the character become more and more blurred until eventually it feels like I'm not writing a character at all. And this, I think, is the core of magic. And I know we can do this technique without any magical ritual. We can do this technique with really very little cultural influences or anything. It's just simply writing in a book if we want it to be. Although we can bring in as much ritual as we want, and that will only make the effect more potent. But because of the nature of this work, I think it's kind of fundamentally core to what magic is. If magic is granting us more liberty, is the process of moving from bondage into freedom, to choose the type of life that we want, to choose the experiences we want to have, and to be able to choose who we are and how we express ourselves in the world, then this technique is the single most potent technique that we have in our arsenal, just because of its kind of laser focus on rewriting our own internal circuitry. So I encourage you to try it, and I encourage you to experiment not only with manifesting experiences that you want to have happen, but also try experimenting with your own internal circuitry.
If we write something and that ends up coming true, is that a premonition or is that something that we've created deliberately? And Grant's answer is that it's both, right? That we are, especially as artists, that we are dipping our toe into the river of consciousness, that all time is happening at once on some level, right? On some plane, all time is simultaneous. So the artist kind of like dips a toe into that water and comes out with something that is meaningful even beyond their spot in linear time.
In his essay on the decay of lying, Oscar Wilde points out that pretty much any young person you look at, you could see them in an earlier painting, right? All fashion and style are first imagined by an artist and cast into a painting or a story before then they disseminate out into the broader culture. More than that, Oscar Wilde goes on to say that this isn't just a simple cause and effect, that an art piece is popular and so people copy it. He claims that, in fact, because creativity is not bound by material reality, it's fluid, it is always urging to create, and material reality is thus always bound to follow, right? By naturally being slower than the creative urge. Because of this, by its own nature, reality and life must always imitate art, as if it is an echo of a creative impulse.
If anything we create has some potential energy in it to manifest, then the more we take control of what we create and the more we take personal responsibility for what we create, then the more control we're going to have over it. You know, I'm not ever gonna say to anyone that something they wrote or whatever is, you did that because you wrote that, right? But for me personally, it's more about opportunity to shape my reality. That if this is a possibility, if I am, dipping my toe into that river of consciousness, then if I have some power within me to be able to alter or affect that, then why wouldn't I want to? why wouldn't I want to use that power to create the things that I do want?
If reality follows what we speak, listen to the stories that we tell ourselves after we fail or after things don't go the way that we want them to, or just throughout the day. What kind of things am I telling myself? Treating these things as not just one-off thoughts in my head, but as actual statements of fact about reality.
Trauma actually affects the way that we interpret our reality around us. The stories that we make up in our heads, right, which is not a way of saying that it's a lie. It's literally just the way that we process and make meaning out of information is vastly affected by our trauma. So yeah, all that confirmation bias basically says that if something is already familiar to us, our brains will essentially cherry pick the 8 billion bits per second of information that are being filtered through our 5+ senses and will cherry pick for the things that are already familiar to it. Can you change a pattern with a hypersigil? It's sort of like, what I would say about that actually is that, I teach another course also in between teaching the Repatterning Project. I teach a course on hypersigils called Myths and Magic. And basically what it is instead of going in and going through all those internal algorithms one by one, we look at the wider stories and characters that we identify with. And so you can actually shift a number of patterns at once just by saying, I'm going to change the archetype that I show up as in the world. I'm going to go from being, the mousy pushover librarian or whatever, and I'm going to be the sex goddess, right? Or, which comes with its own set of complications, right? But you're basically like, you're kind of like mass shifting a whole bunch of internal beliefs by using the power of character and story and archetype to shift the story that you want to tell in the world and the roles that you allow yourselves to play. What I'll say about hypersigils is it's a lot about looking at ourselves as the hero of our own story. And a lot of times without realizing it, we actually end up sort of casting ourselves in a supporting role because it feels safer. It feels safer to let other people be the star of the show and to give in to what they want to do and to just be around for support, right? And that's fine. Like, it's great supporting other people, right? We know we don't always need to like hog the spotlight or whatever, but we don't want to lose sight of ourselves. So I think that at its core, the process of creating a hypersigil asks us, what story do we want to be telling in our lives? And who do we want to be? Who do we want to be showing up as? I would love for folks to check out my band, Arden and the Wolves. So you can find that on like any platform that you can listen to music. I'll have a new 6-song EP called the Bourbon Room Sessions coming out in probably first half of 2023. And then beyond that, the next round of the Repatterning Project starts January 22nd. And as I said, that's an 8-week course, but you go through that 8 weeks and you will learn, the process for, identifying the patterns that you have going on unconsciously, and then bringing them to the surface and changing them if you so desire, how to install new patterns, how to give yourself the conditioning that you would need to get the results that you want in life. So yeah, for sure. Anyone who's interested in joining for this round should reach out to me for sure, and we'll chat about it. I can answer any questions that they might have.
So, have I fully embodied the character that I set out to become? No. But I do feel more confident. I feel like I've taken more risks. And even in producing this video, I think that I've tried some new things that I wouldn't have tried otherwise. I think that I've grown from the experience, but I would consider this experiment a failure. I think some of the things that I did wrong, especially after speaking to Arden, was that I went in very half-baked on the type of hypersigil that I was creating. So in the future, I would like to try this experiment again, but perhaps with a more focused output, like creating a video game or an album or some other creative work that's explicitly deciding to be a hypersigil from the beginning. However, I do think that working in a mode similar to what Aidan Wachter suggests, which is more of a free-flowing journal, I have found that to be deeply rewarding work, and I suggest anyone who's interested to try it. And if you're a creative or an artist, I hope that you ponder some of these questions that we brought up as far as our personal responsibility as creators go, and how to be conscious of the ideas and narratives that we're adding to the world. So if you're a creator or a creative type, or even just a person who's doesn't consider themselves much of an artist but wants to experiment with hypersigils, please let me know down in the comments if you've had any experiences like what was described today, or if you're planning on creating something. I really appreciate everyone sticking around and checking out this video. Please go check out Arden's work. I have left her website and information in the description. And stay tuned to the channel. I've got some exciting stuff coming up in the springtime, probably some more shorter videos on the horizon. If there's other stuff you'd like me to investigate, explore, do experiments with, definitely let me know. Let me know in the comments, shoot me an email. I'm very happy to discuss magic with anyone all the time. So thanks again for sticking around. And I've been Finch, you've been amazing, and I'll catch you next time.